Mom, is it okay if I go out and play?
Of course, Button. Just remember to stay within earshot. It's nearly dinner time.
Alright, Mom. I can do that.
Elena gave a smile as she watched her son run out of the kitchen and into the garden before she returned to what she was doing. She was cooking dinner, though it was a smaller amount than she was used to. It had been a few months since her eldest son had left for college, and her husband was still in Manhattan on work business, so it was just her and Button in the house. She missed the two dearly, but enjoyed spending time with Button. She had loved the experience of raising her eldest son when he was a colt, but as he grew into a young stallion, she was not needed as much as when he was a colt. She missed having the experience. So when Button was born, she was overjoyed that she would once more be able to enjoy the experience of raising a foal. However, recently she had been getting worried about Button's social status at school. The family had moved to Ponyville near the Whitetail Woods a couple of months ago, and in that time Button had only made 1 or 2 friends. And even then she hardly saw them around her house, or Button going to theirs. She had at first blamed the video games Button would always play, and even took them away from him at one point during grounding, after he threatened to slay her, calling her a she-devil. She was stirring the food. She heard Button laughing and talking to himself, and stole a quick glance at what he was doing and smiled, seeing him play with his toy train set, as she returned to the pot. She swore she heard a second voice in the garden with Button. Elena looked up again from her cooking and peeked outside, but only saw Button. She was a little confused, as she swore she definitely heard 2 voices outside and decided to call Button back into the house, seeing as the food was almost ready to eat.
Button, come back inside now. Dinner's almost ready.
She called.
But Mom,
Button whined.
I don't want to yet.
I'm going to count to 5, young colt.
Elena warned.
1, 2...
Okay, I'm coming.
Elena giggled to herself. For some odd reason, that always seemed to work on young foals. And just like his older brother, Button would do what he was told threatened with the counting to 5 threat. She was surprised as well when Button came in. He didn't ask her if any pony could join them. Before he sat down at the table, Button pulled out one of the other chairs at the table and then gently pushed it back in slightly, as he set out 3 plates and took his own seat before Elena came over with the food. She saw the extra plate and looked to Button.
Sweetie, why did you set 3 plates out?
She asked.
It's so my new friend can eat with us.
He replied with a grin.
Oh, a new friend?
She said with a soft smile.
Is that who I heard you talking with outside?
Uh-huh.
Well, aren't you going to go invite him in? He's still outside.
No, he's not. He's sitting right at the table with us.
Button replied. Elena blinked for a moment, then held back a sigh, realizing that the supposed friend was an imaginary one. Still, Button looked so happy, and she decided to play along.
Oh, I see. Does this friend have a name?
He's called Laughing Jack.
Button replied, smiling to the empty seat.
Laughing Jack? That's an interesting name,
she said.
What does he look like?
Button looked to the empty seat, scanned up and down, as if making sure he could describe Jack as best he could.
He's really tall. He's taller than the princess, but almost. And he has this awesome spiral cone nose thingy, and his long hair and long arms, baggy pants, kind of like a clown. Oh, and he has stripy socks and is always smiling and laughing.
My. He sounds like quite the pony.
He's not a pony, Mom.
Button looked over the empty spot again.
He walks on 2 legs and doesn't look like a pony at all.
Elena raised an eyebrow, but shook her head with a smile. She should have known that something he imagined wouldn't be based off a pony. It was most likely based off something from one of his many video games. but for the sake of fun, she played along.
Well, it's very nice to meet you, Jack. Would you like some chips?
She asked to the empty spot. As expected, she received no reply. But Button was looking at the empty spot and was nodding, like he was listening to the answer.
Jack says no thank you. He doesn't eat like we do.
Well, what does he eat then?
Button looked back to the empty spot.
Apart from sweets, he won't say.
Again, she raised an eyebrow to the answer once more and shook her head, giggling. Trust him to say Jack ate sweets. She knew that Button would most likely ask her for some sweets for Jack, but in actual fact, he would eat them when she wasn't looking and claim Jack had. As they ate dinner, Elena couldn't help shaking off a feeling of unease, and wasn't sure why she was feeling it. Button, on the other hand, was happily wallowing down his dinner and making conversation with Jack, which Elena had to admit she found cute. Dinner was soon finished, and Elena brought over dessert for them. A slice of chocolate cake for her and Button, and a handful of hard sweets for Jack after Button had asked her nicely. To which after the third time, she gave in.
Mom, can me and Jack go outside and play?
Button asked.
Of course, sweetie. Just stay where I can see you, okay?
Elena replied as she started to wash up.
Yay!
Button got down from the table and ran outside. Elena smiled as she watched him go before carrying on with the washing up. She turned round when she thought she had heard a second scraping sound from behind her, and saw that the chair Jack was sitting in had been pushed back slightly. She studied it for a moment, and then remembered how Button had pulled the chair out before dinner, and decided he must have pulled it out as well.
Good night, Button. Sweet dreams.
Good night, Mom. I love you.
I love you too, sweetie.
Elena finished tucking Button into his bed and gave him a soft kiss on his head before flicking off the nightlight. As she came to his door, she turned around as to give one last check to make sure everything was in order. A soft smile found its way onto her face as she saw Button softly sleeping, a toy plush dragon from one of his games firmly in his grip, as she slowly closed the door and headed downstairs. As she entered the living room, the telephone rang, and she walked over to it and picked it up.
Hello?
Hi, honey. It's me.
Button's father replied.
I know it's you. No one else calls me honey like that.
And you love it.
She heard him reply with a chuckle.
I'm not too late to say goodnight to the champ, am I?
I'm afraid so, dear. I just put the little one to bed.
Ah. Well, could you let him know tomorrow that his old man loves him?
Of course, dear. How's your day been?
Oh, you know, the usual.
He chuckled.
Boring business and all that. And you?
Well, Button made a new friend today.
Elena replied.
Did he?
He replied, his tone filled with excitement.
And who is his new friend?
Laughing Jack.
Elena replied.
That's an odd name.
It's an imaginary friend, dear.
Ah, that makes much more sense. I suppose we all go through that phase. Why, I had an imaginary friend who was a sea dragon with jets for legs.
Is that so?
She asked, a smirk forming on her face.
You never told me that.
Well, that's because it was a silly thing from my childhood. That's why.
I bet you had all sorts of fun together, didn't you?
She teased.
Was he your bestie-westie friend forever?
Har har.
He sarcastically replied.
You're not going to let that one go, are you?
Nope.
Figures. I'd better get to bed myself. Have an early morning meeting to be bright and alert for. Good night, honey. I love ya.
Love you too, dear. Sleep well.
Elena replied before putting the phone down. Elena settled herself down onto the sofa, planning to do a little bit of reading before she herself would retire to bed. About half an hour later, she heard Button's door creak open and her ears twitched before she heard the sounds of hoofsteps walking onto the landing as if it was creeping.
Button, that better not be you trying to sneak downstairs to eat more cake,
she said sternly, but with a smirk on her face.
Rats.
She heard Button whisper. The hoofstep retreated back into Button's room before his door closed. Elena couldn't help but chuckle and went back to reading her magazine. After around 10 minutes of reading, she had felt her eyelids get heavy and let out a yawn, deciding it was time for her to go to bed. Slowly making her way upstairs, she first opened Button's door softly so no creak could be heard to make sure that he was sound asleep. Happy that he was indeed asleep, she slowly closed the door and headed towards her own bedroom. After brushing her teeth and settling herself into bed, she switched off the light and closed her eyes with another yawn. Elena woke up with a start. She had heard something smash downstairs, making her heart beat rapidly as she switched on the light. She slowly made her way to the bedroom door, in time to hear the sound of rapid hoofsteps running up to the stairs and stopping, opening the door with a flash. She looked to see Button's door with a look of anger on her face as she saw it close softly. Walking right up to his door, she opened it and saw Button was wrapped up tightly in his duvet, like she had left him earlier that night, but she wasn't having any of it.
Button Mash, I know you're awake.
Silence. With a roll of her eyes, she walked over to his bed and gently shook him. She watched in annoyance at his pretending I was asleep routine as he yawned, sat up, and rubbed his eyes.
Mom?
Don't pretend you were asleep, young colt.
She started.
I heard something smash downstairs, followed by your footsteps, and saw your door close.
But Mom, I was asleep.
Button replied, not sure what was going on.
Button, don't lie to me.
But Mom, I really was.
Elena could see some tears forming in the corner of his eyes. This made her rethink her actions. Button had never really truly lied to her before, except for a couple of times where he had stayed up late playing video games. And the sincerity in his voice made her doubt herself. Had she just been hearing things? She let out a sigh and pulled him into a soft cuddle. He sniffled and returned it as she gently kissed him on the head.
Oh, I'm sorry, Button. I guess I was just hearing things. Tell you what, you can have an extra slice of cake for dessert tomorrow as a way for waking you up like this.
All right, Mom. Thanks.
Button smiled as he yawned. Elena kissed his head and tucked him back into bed before leaving his room once more. As she closed the door, she bit her lip and looked over the landing down to the darkness of the living room.
I was certain I heard something,
she muttered to herself. She slowly descended the stairs and turned the lights on in the living room. As the lights flickered on and illuminated the room, Elena made her way towards the kitchen, slowly and cautiously, her ears twitching for any sounds that shouldn't be there. With a quick flick of her hoof, she hit the light switch in the kitchen and was quickly engulfed in light. As she slowly entered, all the while looking for anything out of place, she soon came across what had made the noise. On the floor, now in pieces, was the glass jar she had kept the hard sweets in, just like the one she had given to Jack on Button's request earlier. From her first inspection, it looked like it had simply fallen off the counter. She also noticed that several sweets had been removed from the jar, as she was certain that there was a lot more in them earlier, even with what she had taken out earlier. Just to be on the safe side, she would search Button's room whilst he was at school, just to satisfy her uncertainty about the whole affair. Elena cleared up the glass from the floor carefully before disposing it into the bin and placed the remaining sweets into the drawers, then turning off the lights in the kitchen and the living room before finally returning upstairs to her bed and falling asleep. Elena woke up with a gasp. She had woken up from her dream by the sound of laughing foals and looked around her room. Her eyes went wide when she realized she was still in her bed, but she was no longer in her room, rather a large open forest in the middle of nowhere. She slowly got out of bed and began to walk down the pathway that was to her right. She didn't know why she had decided to walk. It was like something was calling out to her. She didn't know what. As she continued to walk past the dead trees, the moonlight peeking through the branches, she heard the sounds of foals laughing again, and saw shadows running along the side with her, just being so far out for her not to be able to see them properly. Suddenly, she heard a soft, musical song that echoed all throughout the entire forest. It was like no song she had ever heard before, but she couldn't help but start humming along for some reason. It was too catchy not to. Eventually, the pathway broke from the forest and led to what seemed like an abandoned carnival. Everywhere she looked, there were abandoned rides, old tents used for games, food vending tents, benches, chairs, and tables. She felt a shiver go down her spine as the wind blew across the abandoned carnival. Somewhere she had heard the creak of something metal nearby. She swallowed a lump in her throat. Suddenly, right in front of her, in a large, run-down-looking tent, she heard the laughter again. As she started at the tent, the strange song that was being played started to slow down. Everything in her body was telling her to run away, but for some reason against her will, she started to head towards the tent. As she came closer and closer, the song played louder and slower, until she had come to the entrance. The flap of the tent slowly pulled itself aside, and she proceeded to enter the tent, despite the screaming in her head. The second she entered, the song came to an abrupt stop, and the tent flap suddenly resumed its original position, leaving Elena in the pitch-black tent.
Hello?
She managed to finally choke out. She received no answer, just the eerie silence. Elena felt her entire body shake in fear as she tried to will her body to move, to get out of there as fast as she could. But then her body froze, and her eyes went wide, as just in front of her, the other end of the tent, a small candle lit up and illuminated the tent slightly. But what she saw, or rather barely saw, made her become fearful of her life. She could just make the outlines of at least a dozen foals, but that wasn't the worst part. All of them had some form of mutilation on their bodies. Some of them had only one eye or not at all. The blood still oozed down their faces. There were unicorns with horns badly cut off and bent in unnatural angles, and Pegasi with deformed wings back in painful angles. She could see they all had lacerations all over their bodies and had to hold back the urge to vomit. When one of the foals stepped forward into the light, she could clearly see half of its skull was missing and its brain was visible. The poor foal's head had stained with deep red. What terrified her more was that all the children had a manic and twisted grin on their faces. Elena tried to scream, but nothing came out. She tried to move her legs, but they wouldn't respond. And then she heard it. The song began again, softly, and someone was humming along loudly. But it wasn't coming from any of the foals. In a panic, she tried to find what was making the humming sound as the foals started to advance on her. Elena saw that they were wielding knives that seemed to float alongside of them, and finally her voice came to her as she screamed when one of the knives sliced into her side, causing a deep gash that sprayed blood, making her cry even more. One by one, the foal's knives swang and cut into her, leaving gash after gash into her flesh. As she screamed in pain, the blood stained her coat and pooled on the ground. As much as she struggled, she couldn't move her legs. The knives kept plunging and cutting into her. She felt tears stream down her face as she struggled to keep consciousness. The humming grew louder and louder to the point where it was all she could hear, even over her own screams. As she felt the world slowly fade out as the pain took over, she struggled to keep her eyes open, managed to make the outline of something dark and tall slowly walking towards her. The last thing she heard was a humming slowing down and coming to a stop.
I'll be seeing you soon.
Elena sat bolt upright, panting heavily. Her eyes went wide as her entire body was covered in a cold sweat. She looked around the room to see she was back inside her bedroom and let out a sigh of relief.
It was just a dream?
She wiped her brow and saw that the time was 8 o'clock, and immediately began to panic, realizing that it was almost time for Button to go to school. Scrambling out of her bed, she rushed over to Button's room, opening the door only to see his bed was empty.
Button!
She called out.
I'm in the kitchen, Mom.
Elena made her way downstairs quickly to find Button in the kitchen, smiling to himself and making a sandwich. She let out a sigh of relief as she entered the kitchen.
I woke up before you and didn't want to wake you up.
Button said.
I appreciate it, sweetie, but it's a school day and I need to take you there, so you should have woken me up when you saw I was asleep.
Yes, Mom.
Button sighed.
Good boy. Now go get your saddlebags ready, and I'll finish up here.
Button nodded and headed out of the room as Elena went over to his lunch and started to finish making it, trying to figure out if her bizarre nightmare had any meaning behind it.
Have a great day at school, sweetie.
Elena said to Button, nuzzling his cheek.
Oh, I will. Mom, can you say goodbye to Jack, too?
He asked, pointing to the empty space next to him. Elena rolled her eyes. Although only a day has gone since Button created his imaginary friend, she did wonder if the other foals might bully him about it. But regardless, she smiled anyway and looked over to the empty space beside her son.
Goodbye, Jack. Have a fun day at school as well.
As she gently patted the spot, her eyes went wide as a sudden chill shot down her hoof, and she gasped, pulling back her hoof. Button didn't hear her, as he had been called over by the couple of friends he did have, Rumble and Scootaloo. The latter he had been paired with for a science experiment, and they had formed a small friendship. Elena shook off the feeling she had with another shiver, and looked over to Button, seeing the two foals were being joined by two others, whom she recognized as Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom. Maybe today he will make some new friends, and might stop with this Jack character, she thought to herself. Elena waved goodbye to Button as she turned around and headed for home, ready to start her daily routine. It was home time. Elena had picked Button up along with the other various parents and siblings. But she was also walking back to her house with Sweetie Belle, Scootaloo, Apple Bloom, and Rumble. When she had been about to leave, she was approached by the foal's siblings, who said they had all expressed wanting to go to Button's house for the day and asked Elena if that was okay. Elena was naturally more than happy, smiling to herself that Button had made friends. although she was still a bit puzzled about her nightmare, as well as the fact that when he had searched Button's room, she could find no trace of the missing sweets. They soon reached home. Elena let them out into the back garden as she began to prepare dinner. She decided that since this was a special occasion, she would make homemade pasta and sauce for the young foals. As she began to prepare the food for them, she couldn't help but swing her hips and hum a merry tune. Halfway through setting everything to cook, she began to hear the sounds of singing coming from outside. Out of curiosity, Elena looked up from her cooking and out the window to see the foals dancing in a circle, all smiling and seemingly having a great time. With a soft smile of her own, she decided to open the door and watch them as the pasta cooked. Her smile was soon replaced with a look of shock and unease as she heard them sing.
All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought was all in fun. Pop goes the weasel.
They fell about the ground laughing as Elena watched in silent horror, fear growing by the second. The song they had been singing had the exact same tune as a song from her nightmare. She had never heard of that song before and had no idea how Button and his friends knew it. With a forceful shake of her head, she decided to call them all in for dinner.
Button, you need to come in now. Dinner's almost ready.
But
Now!
She snapped. Button flinched at the sudden harshness of his mother's tone, as did his friends. Slowly, they all headed back inside and quietly settled around the table as Elena silently went back to cooking. Elena started to feel bad about how he had snapped at the foals, and decided to make it up to them with some extra dessert, more so than she had already promised Button from disturbing him the previous night. As they sat in silence and ate their meal, only a few words were exchanged. The silence became too much for Elena to bear, as she finally spoke up.
So who wants chocolate cake?
She asked with a smile. As she had expected and wanted, the foals all grinned and declared their desire to feast on chocolate cake. As Elena sat down and handed everyone 2 slices and gave herself one, she listened to them happily chomping and giggling amongst themselves. Just as she was about to tuck into her slice, she remembered about the song and decided to ask about it.
That was a nice song you were singing earlier. Who taught it to you?
She asked.
Laughing Jack did. He played the song with his music box and taught us the lyrics.
Of all the answers she was expecting, including that one, she had been expecting Button to reply, especially if the answer was Jack.
Laughing Jack did?
She asked, and the foals nodded.
But I thought he was your imaginary friend, Button.
he's not imaginary.
He really isn't Miss Button's mom.
Rumble added.
Yeah, he's standing over by Sweetie Belle and Button.
Apple Bloom added. Elena looked around and saw no one in the room with them. But when Apple Bloom pointed her hoof, she followed its direction to where Jack was supposed to be standing, and she felt everything in her body go cold and numb. As she continued to stare, a wave of fear consuming her. The slow tune from her nightmare began to play softly, once more drowning out any other sounds. Her vision blurred as she continued to stare, her pupils getting smaller, and the song grew louder and louder.
Mom,
Button asked, shaking her softly.
you okay?
Elena shook her head and came out of her trance-like state and noticed all the foals were looking at her slightly concerned. She wiped her brow of sweat she had formed and smiled at them.
Sorry about that. I was off in my own little world. Why don't you go out and play for a bit more before your friends go home, Button?
With a happy grin, Button and his friends rushed out of the house to carry on playing. The second they left, Elena let out a choked sob and a breath she hadn't known she had been holding.
What was that feeling?
She shivered. When Elena had dropped off Button's friends to their homes, the two had returned to their house, and after much pleading, she'd allowed Button to go out and play in the garden, seeing it was still light out. But only for an hour before he had to get himself ready for bed. She sat herself in the living room to try and relax after the day's strange events and flipped open her magazine. After about 10 minutes of reading, she heard the back door of the garden open, and thinking it was Button, she ignored it and continued to read. Her ears shot up alert when she heard heavy, slow footsteps moving in the kitchen. Slowly, she turned her head to try and peer into the kitchen to see if Button was in there. But she saw nothing.
Button, you in the kitchen?
She called out. No answer. Placing her magazine down, she slowly got up, only to hear the sound of a drawer being slowly pulled open, the wood scraping loud enough to echo in the living room.
Button!
Again, no answer. Swallowing hard, she slowly made her way towards the kitchen. Elena froze, hearing the sounds of plastic wrappers being rustled, and realized that the drawer that had the sweets in was the one that was open. With a sigh, she realized it must be Button trying to snake in some sweets. She entered the kitchen, and sure enough, the drawer was open. But Button wasn't there.
Come out, Button. I know you're in here.
For the third time, Elena received no reply. With a frustrated sigh, she walked around the table, expecting to see Button lying on the floor, or his tail poking out from under the tablecloth. However, she didn't see him. No one was there. Elena looked around the kitchen a little puzzled. She was definitely certain that someone had to be in the kitchen. The only one it could have been was Button. She turned to close the drawer and jumped with a startled yelp when the kitchen door to the garden had suddenly slammed shut. She quickly ran over, thinking that Button had been hiding, and made a dash outside, only to be greeted by an empty garden. Immediately she began to panic and ran outside, looking around for him.
Button? Button!
She walked a few feet to the end of the garden in hopes he was there, when she heard the kitchen door slam shut again. Spinning around almost immediately, she ran back into the house and yanked the door open before rushing inside to find Button in the living room with a happy smile on his face. Elena blinked in shock as she felt a mixture of relief but at the same time confusion on how Button had gotten into the house without her knowing.
Button, when did you come in?
She asked.
Just now. I heard you call for me.
He replied.
But you weren't in the garden.
Elena said.
I went out there and you weren't there.
I was in the front, Mom.
Button. I said not to go out in the front without telling me first. I was worried sick and... Button, where did you get those sweets?
Button was chewing on a few sweets as a couple of discarded wrappers lay beside him on the sofa. Elena recognized them as the sweets from the drawer, but was confused on how they got there.
Laughing Jack got them for me. He said you didn't mind.
Okay, I've had it with this Laughing Jack nonsense, Button.
Elena snapped.
He isn't real. Now tell me the truth.
But I am telling the truth. Why are you shouting at me?
Button replied, some tears in his eyes, completely confused to why she was shouting. Elena sighed and sat next to him, pulling him into a hug as Button sniffed.
Oh, I'm sorry, Button, but this is serious now. Did you take these sweets or not?
No, I swear! Laughing Jack did give them to me.
Button, that's enough. Go to your room.
Button whimpered softly and ran upstairs to his room, holding back his tears. Elena heard his door slam and sighed, rubbing her temples with her hooves.
Hello.
Hey, honey. How are ya?
It's been a rough day.
You okay? You don't sound it.
Elena sighed as she began to regale her husband about the events of the day, starting with her nightmare.
Sounds pretty creepy. Maybe you should lay out the sweets before bed.
He teased.
This is serious. When Button got home with his new friends...
New friends? Are you serious? That's great.
He interrupted.
Yes, it is, but it gets worse. You know that damn song from my nightmare?
Uh-huh.
Button and his friends were singing it in the garden.
That is a little odd.
And Scootaloo said that Laughing Jack taught it to him.
Wait, I thought Laughing Jack was Button's imaginary friend.
That's what I thought. But his friends were adamant that they could see him, and when I looked where they pointed... Oh, Celestia, I was terrified. Nothing was there, but I had this awful feeling that scared me.
Elena said, stifling another sob.
Whoa, calm down, honey. It's okay. I'm sure it was nothing.
And then, when I got home, I caught Button stealing sweets, but he claims Laughing Jack gave them to him. And how he got into the house and got the sweets made no sense either.
Look.
She heard him sigh.
You should get some rest. You seem tired. I'll be home in a couple of days, and we can both sit down and talk to Button about this Laughing Jack. Okay?
Okay, dear. I love you.
I love you too, honey. Give my love to Button for me.
I will. Good night.
Elena sighed and placed the phone down, falling onto the sofa and closing her eyes, trying to calm herself down. She decided she would get a glass of water and head herself off to bed, but wondered if she would revisit the same nightmare from the previous night. Elena jumped and heard the door slam from downstairs, followed by Button screaming in terror, followed by several crashes. In a second, she grabbed the knife and ran upstairs with speed that rivaled even Rainbow Dash, and ran into his room, bashing the door down in one move. The light was flickering and swung from the ceiling gently. From what she saw, the room had been trashed. Everything was either on the floor, broken, or flung across the room. Several scratch marks had been bedded into the walls, and she gasped and rushed over to Button, who was curled up against the wall, shivering in fear and in a pool of his own urine, tears staining his face. She quickly scooped him up and ran out of the room, casting a quick glance behind her, seeing that the bed had been ravaged by something sharp. Elena ran to the neighbor's house and frantically banged on the door as Button clung onto her for dear life. Soon, she saw the lights flicker on upstairs, and soon, hoofsteps coming down from upstairs.
Who in the hell is knocking on my door at this hour?
She heard from the other side of the door before it was opened.
Buddy, do you... What the... Elena?
Please let me in, Caramel. I need to use your phone. It's an emergency.
Caramel saw Button crying hard into his mother's neck, as well as the smell of urine. Coupled with the desperation and fear on her face, it was enough to convince him to let her in. Shortly after using the phone, the guard that was stationed in Ponyville responded and soon arrived at Caramel's house. After searching thoroughly throughout Elena's house, they found no one was there and suggested that she may have interrupted an attempted burglary or phone-napping. Elena wasn't convinced though. She was convinced that something non-pony had done something. As Button was put into bed in the spare room of Caramel and his wife's house, Elena made a quick phone call to her husband to explain what had happened. Disturbed by what his wife said, he had promised he would get an earlier train home and arrive back either the following evening or the morning after. Relieved by this, Elena headed upstairs into bed and cuddled up close to Button, holding him protectively in her chest as they fell asleep. It had been a long and tiring day. Neither Button or his mother had gotten much sleep. She had spent the day at Caramel's house whilst Button had gone to school, waiting for the verdict from the guard who had sent a team of forensic ponies down to try and find some form of DNA evidence or anything else that could be used to link to who it was that tried to kidnap or burgle Elena's house. Around 5 in the afternoon, after she had gone to pick Button up, She had been informed by the guard that she and Button could go home and that 2 guards would be stationed in front and back of the house for a while, night and day shifts, till the one who was responsible was caught. At first, Button was terrified and hesitant about going back into the house. But on being reassured of the protection and that his father was going to be home the next morning, he and his mother went home. Button hadn't really spoken that day. He didn't tell anyone what he saw and refused to speak about it, only saying that he woke up to the room in chaos. But Elena's motherly instincts thought otherwise. That evening went on fairly normal save for how quiet it was. Elena and Button ate their dinner. She refused to let him play outside and practically followed him everywhere except to the toilet. Every hour or so, the guards had reported to her on their findings as well as making sure she and Button were still okay. Elena had decided to have Button sleep in her bed with her that night. As she tucked him in, she could hear him whimpering softly.
It's okay, sweetie. Mommy's here. The windows are bolted, the doors are locked, and the guards are outside. No pony is going to hurt you, okay?
Okay, Mom. I love you.
Love you too, sweetie.
She gently kissed his forehead before the phone rang.
Mommy will come up in a moment. That's probably your father telling me he's on his way.
Button nodded as he curled into his sheets, and after cautiously looking around, he closed his eyes as his mother left the room, the knife from the previous night in her hoof, leaving the light on as well as the door open. She walked into the living room and reached for the phone, clearing her throat before answering.
Hello?
She received no reply.
Hello?
This time, she was replied with the sound of the phone being hung up. Just as she was about to shrug it off and head upstairs, a loud thud came from the kitchen that startled her. She slowly turned to peer into the kitchen, and her eyes went wide, seeing that the light was off and the kitchen was pitch black. Slowly and cautiously, she entered the kitchen and flicked the switch, filling the room with a bright light as she stifled a scream at what she saw. Laying on the kitchen table, with a look of frozen shock on his face, was a guard from the back door. His throat had been ripped out, and his blood that stained his fur and armor was pooling around his body as it started to drip onto the floor. She began to shake as her eyes trailed down his body and saw that his chest had been sliced open from the throat to his crotch. Holding back a wave of vomit, she saw that instead of his intestines, which she noticed was in a pile on the floor beside him, his entire body was crammed full of sweets. The sweets she kept in the glass jar. The sweets Button had earlier.
Button!
She cried as her eyes went wild. She turned around to leave the kitchen, but felt something shove her hard. With a cry of pain, she was violently shoved into the table, dropping the knife with a clang as the sound of heavy footsteps ran out of the kitchen and into the living room. Elena saw the living room door slam shut and frantically looked for the knife she dropped, but not seeing it anywhere. Knowing she didn't have enough time to grab another, she made the decision to run towards the living room door. Just as she heard something run up the stairs, the footsteps pounding onto the wood.
Please help me!
She screamed for the other guard to hear. She didn't wait for him to reply. Instead, she threw open the door of the living room and ran up the stairs.
Help!
Elena's heart skipped a beat as she raced upstairs and heard Button scream. It was in her room. It was after her baby. She bashed her shoulder onto the door as Button continued to scream. After the second attempt, she bashed it open, only to hear a smash as the window was broken and caught a glimpse of Button being pulled out of it. Running downwards, almost tripping over her hoofs, she threw open the front door to see the body of the other guard, in the same shocked frozen position as the other, with his belly stuffed to bursting with sweets. She didn't stare too long though, as she ran around the side of the house, tears in her eyes and her heart pounding. Elena desperately looked around to see where Button was, to hear him screaming in the direction of the Whitetail Woods. Running like her life depended on it, she rushed to the edge of the woods to catch another glimpse of Button, screaming as he was being dragged by his hind legs fast by something obscured by darkness and deeper into the woods. Elena gave chase as best she could, her eyes never leaving Button's, who was screaming over and over as he desperately tried to break free of his fall napper's grip, tears streaming down his face as she began to pant heavily, her stamina giving out slowly. Button cried out before disappearing around the group of trees. Elena reached over the corner to find herself on a path, but couldn't see Button anywhere. She began to break down sobbing as she frantically looked around, stumbling as she twisted and turned her body trying to hear him.
Button?
She screamed for him. She received no answer.
No. Celestia, please no.
She sobbed. She suddenly heard a loud, sharp scream from her left. She felt her entire soul go ice cold, and her legs quivered slightly. But she took off towards the scream, praying that she wasn't too late. Elena suddenly tripped over a root that was jutting out of the ground that she hadn't seen and crashed into the ground hard, crying out in pain. Shakily, she got back up onto her hooves and looked around her, seeing nothing but trees and darkness.
Button!
She screamed. Silence. Elena choked on a sob before breaking down into tears. She had no idea where Button was, and she fell to her knees harshly, sobbing her heart out. She suddenly felt something land with a wet splat on her, followed by a rapid dripping of liquid for a brief moment that caught her off guard. Jumping to her hooves, she dabbed one on her face, then looked at it. Her eyes went wide. In the soft light of the moon, she could easily see the dark liquid on her hoof, but her breathing became deep and heavy as she saw what had hit her on the head and fallen onto the ground, staining her face with blood. A tongue. Slowly looking up and shaking like crazy, she tried to see where the blood had come from, soon wishing that she hadn't. She wanted to scream, but all that came out of her mouth was stuttered gasps. Her eyes filled once again with tears as she felt her legs grow weak, and she vomited. Hanging by a branch on one of the trees was Button. His stomach had been sliced open, and his intestines was wrapped around his neck, strangling him and hanging him on the branch. His other organs had been removed and replaced with sweets, making his sides bulge slightly, and some started to fall onto the ground. Blood leaked from his mouth and his chest, dripping down his legs and onto the ground below. His eyes looked dead and were wide with fear as his tears, still fresh, stained his cheeks, and she realized the tongue that had hit her was Button's, and had been partially cut out of his mouth.
No!
She screamed. She fell to the ground once more, vomiting hard again, before sobbing into her hooves. Her baby, her little Button, was dead. She had failed to protect him, failed him as a mother. That's when she heard the soft sound of a music box playing behind her, followed by the same infernal humming she immediately recognized from her nightmare. Slowly turning around and held back another scream, she finally came face to face with it. Laughing Jack. His skin was as white as a ghost, and his black hair came to his shoulders. Two piercing white eyes surrounded by black rings pierced into Elena's and deep into her mind. As he smiled at her, he revealed his twisted, sharp teeth. His entire body looked grotesque and wrong, as his arms dangled past his waist and near the floor. The way he stood almost looked like he was a marionette on a string. And just like Button had described, he was wearing a striped black and white outfit that looked like what a clown would wear, along with striped sleeves and socks. Elena saw in his hand was a small silver music box, a tiny handle that was turning slowly and playing the song. She heard him softly start to laugh, a low, sickening laugh that started to get louder and louder as he threw his head back, pleased with her reaction to everything.
You monster!
Jack simply continued to laugh, slowly walking around her without a care in the world, as he suddenly came to an abrupt stop. He turned to her and gave her a sick, twisted grin and slowly lifted his other hand, revealing a bloodied knife. The knife she had dropped. He must have taken it when she found the guard's body. The knife was stained with what she knew was her son's blood and the guard's. Her fear soon gave way to pure rage and anger at the creature.
You'll pay for what you've done! Demon! I'll fucking kill you!
Not giving a damn about anything else, Elena charged at Jack, every fiber in her body being hell-bent on tearing the monster apart. Just as she was about to reach him, she felt something grab her entire body, effectively freezing her in place. Elena struggled to move, but to no avail, as Jack slowly advanced on her. She closed her eyes tight as she choked back another sob, knowing her life was going to end by his hand. But nothing happened. She slowly opened her eyes again. Jack was crouching inches away from her, his twisted grin even more now. Elena watched in frozen fear as he forcefully grabbed her right hoof and held it up, then slammed the knife handle into it, forcing her to hold it. She tried to scream or make any kind of noise, but nothing came out. Just as Elena felt her body began to respond again, she heard noises coming from behind her, as if several things were running in her direction. She was about to turn to see what it was. Then she noticed that Jack had started to back up, softly laughing at her, and suddenly vanished.
No! Come back, you bastard!
She gritted her teeth before breaking down again, sobbing heavily as she laid on the ground. Her sobs echoed all around her. Elena looked at the knife in her hoof before she had several lights shine on her and the area around, and saw several heavily armed guards being followed by the elements of harmony, having run into the woods upon hearing the screams. They stared at her face, which was still covered in blood and confusion, before they looked up and seen the body of Button. Two of the guards immediately vomited, as did Fluttershy, Rarity, Pinky, and Twilight and Rainbow Dash and Applejack, barely keeping it together. Slowly, Elena looked from their faces of utter shock and disbelief to the knife in her hoof, and made a terrible realization.
No, it wasn't me.
One year had passed since the fateful night where tragedy hit the small town of Ponyville. The town was still reeling back from the shock of what happened in the Whitetail Woods, and hundreds had gathered to the old home of Button in order to lay down flowers in his memory, just like they did a year ago. All 4 princesses had traveled down to the town in order to oversee the remembrance service, as well as offer their sympathy and condolences to Button's family, especially his father. Even Discord, the embodiment of chaos, had come to pay his respects, his usual cheerful and playful self gone, as he stayed close to the weeping Fluttershy for the duration of the service. Button's father had heard the news when he had arrived in Ponyville earlier next morning via a newspaper boy at the station, and had broken down, sobbing his heart out, and had to be held up by a couple of guards stationed at the station. Throughout the year, he had struggled to come to terms with what had happened. He couldn't believe his wife would do something like that, but the evidence was too overwhelming. He soon turned to drinking in order to try and numb the pain, which led to his family forcing him to go to rehab, worried about his health. Button's brother, on the other hand, no one really knew how he was. When he heard the news, he had difficulty understanding what had happened. And on the night before he was escorted back to his father and family, he simply got up and vanished. No one had even heard from him over the course of the year, which pushed his father further into his depression, leading to a suicide attempt. On the fateful night, Elena was arrested for murder and quickly whisked away by the guards stationed at Ponyville and detained overnight. They had decided to question her as they waited for the arrival of Princess Celestia, who had been informed of the brutality of the murder, and had stated she would speak with Elena herself. During the questioning, the guards began to question the sanity of Elena, as all she would do is scream.
It wasn't me! It was Laughing Jack!
Needless to say, when Princess Celestia arrived a couple of hours later, the guards brought their concerns of her sanity to her, and the psychologist from the local hospital came to examine her. He concluded to the princess that Elena displayed clear signs of severe paranoia and insanity. When the morning came, Elena was questioned by Princess Celestia, who received the exact same answers the guards did, only by now, Elena would periodically and erratically laugh out of nowhere before sobbing heavily. With the media and the kingdom watching, and with the amount of evidence, Princess Celestia had no choice but to sentence Elena to the Trottingham Asylum for the critically ill, in order to try and get her some help.
It wasn't me. It wasn't me. I didn't do...
Every day she would scream her innocence, whilst all the time laughing, crying, and in the dead of night, she would sometimes sing a strangely catchy yet creepy little song before laughing. Whitetail Woods remained empty of activity for some time after the murder. Families never went there for a leisurely walk or picnics. The running of the leaves race was cancelled, as the path ran right past the tree where everything happened. The only ponies who did go there were the ones with a sick, twisted sense of curiosity. As the service came to an end, and everyone left to return their daily routines as best they could, one little filly was heading to the outskirts of the town, heading to the one place she could regularly go to, where either her big sister was busy with her job, or her friends were unavailable for a while. As she headed up the steps and into the wooden building, she heard the clouds boom with thunder, before the telltale signs of rain falling echoed all around the wooden structure. With a disgruntled groan, the filly pulled up one of the many cushions, dotted around, and plopped herself on it. She saw a book nearby, and with a smile, she pulled over a copy of Daring Do and began to read it, waiting for the rain to stop. The purple-maned filly's head shot upright when she heard a loud creak outside of the door, as if someone was stepping on the wooden steps outside. She was about to call out to whoever it was, but was stopped when she heard a familiar song being played from behind the door. A soft, gentle hum slowly followed as the handle started to turn.
Jack? Is that you?